The wind hissed across the valley like an old warning, pushing dust over the boots of Arlen, a humble wanderer whose only wealth was a battered pot, a wooden ladle, and a recipe for stew his mother had sworn could warm even the coldest. Destiny. That evening, after a long trek through abandoned foothills, he found a small sheltered hollow between two ancient stones and set his fire, stirring a slow-cooking mixture of roots, dried meat, and herbs picked from the wild. The night deepened, stars blinking awake. When the ground trembled ever so slightly, not the stomp of a beast but something heavier, slower, carrying centuries of fatigue, Arlen stiffened, hand hovering over the small knife at his side. But from the darkness emerged a figure so tall the firelight reached only his chest at first. His clothes were in tatters, his face hidden beneath tangled hair, and scars ran like pale rivers across his arms. A giant, but not merely a large man, something older, something carved by hardship. His voice rumbled like distant thunder as he asked, without pride or threat, "Do you share fire, or shall I move on?" Arlen saw the exhaustion in the stranger's eyes, the kind that hollowed a man's will. He swallowed his fear and gestured toward the flames. "Sit, warm yourself. I have stew enough." The giant hesitated as though unused to kindness, then lowered himself with a weight that shook the earth. When the aroma of the stew reached him, something in him softened, a wall crumbling. He accepted the bowl with hands that could crush. Stone yet trembled like a child's. As he ate, he spoke little, only watching the fire as though remembering things too heavy to carry in words. But after a long silence, he finally whispered, "You should not have offered me food." "Stranger?" Arlen blinked. "Why?" The giant raised his head, and for a moment something powerful flickered behind his eyes. "Because the world feeds on fear, kindness is a rare and dangerous gift." He fell silent again, as though he had said too much. But the weight of his words hung over the fire. When the pot emptied and the flames dipped low, the giant rose, taller now that he stood at full height, towering like a living mountain. "Sleep without fear," he rumbled. "No harm will touch you while my feet stand on this ground." Arlen didn't fully understand, but exhaustion overtook him. He slept beneath the stars, comforted by the deep, rhythmic rumble of the giant's breathing somewhere in the dark. At dawn he awoke alone. No footprints, no sign of heavy footsteps. Only the faint impression of weight on the earth beside him, too large to be human. Before he could process the strangeness, shadows moved at the horizon. Not clouds, not beasts, warriors. Hundreds of them, marching in formation with spears lifted and banners whipped by the wind. Their armor glinted gold and silver, their faces stern, and they surrounded him in a wide circle. Arlen froze, hands raised. A commander stepped forward, broad-shouldered, tattooed with symbols of ancient clans, and bowed low, fist to chest. "By decree of the High Blood," the commander boomed, voice echoing over the valley, "we honor the man who showed mercy to our lost king." Arlen's heartbeat thundered in his ears. "Your king?" The commander nodded solemnly. "The one you fed last night? The one we have searched for across 30 moons. He who wanders in exile until a worthy soul shows kindness with no hope of reward. You, traveler, have passed the great measure." Arlen could barely breathe, but he was ragged, starving. "I didn't know." "You were not meant to know," the commander replied. Then, incredibly, the entire army knelt, spears lowered to the earth, armor clattering like rolling thunder. A shockwave of awe crashed through Arlen's chest. The commander's voice rose again. "From this day, the warriors of the Stoneblood Legion bow to you, protector of our king." And as the morning sun spilled across the bowed warriors, Arlen realized his life, once small, quiet, and unnoticed, had shifted into a destiny far larger than he had ever imagined. All because he shared a pot of simple stew with a stranger who was far more than he appeared. The valley echoed with the metallic murmur of kneeling warriors, and Arlen, who had risen that morning expecting to pack his pot and continue a lonely journey, now stood at the center of a legend unfolding far faster than his mind could grasp. Silence held the air as the commander extended an amulet, an obsidian stone wrapped in braided silver. "This," he said, "is the mark of the king's chosen." Before Arlen could refuse, deny, or even question what fate had hurled at him, the ground trembled once more, not from marching feet, but from a single enormous presence approaching from the eastern ridge. The warriors lowered their heads in reverence as the ragged stranger from the night before appeared, no longer slouched and weary but standing, Tall like the very mountains bowed beneath him. His hair was tied back with a strip of ceremonial cloth, his scars painted with ash and gold, and although he still wore scraps of his tattered cloak, it now seemed like a shroud he was shedding. Arlen stared, breath caught. The giant, the man who had eaten his stew, stepped forward, each footfall commanding the earth to obey. "You shared your fire," the king said, voice deep enough to send ripples through Arlen's bones. "Your food, your safety, without knowing who I was, or what I had lost." Arlen shook his head weakly. "It was just stew." "No," the king corrected gently. "It was a choice, one this world rarely makes." He looked at his warriors, then at Arlen. "For 30 moons I walked among men to see if compassion remained in the lands.
I once ruled."
They offered me stones, curses, threats, but you offered warmth." He raised his massive hand and placed it over his heart. "For that, by ancient oath, my kingdom is bound to honor you." Arlen tried to protest. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't brave. He wasn't chosen for anything, but the king stepped closer, lowering himself until his immense height no longer overshadowed but invited. "Do not fear greatness, Arlen," he said softly. "Greatness often begins with small kindness." The warriors rose as one, lifting their spears in a resounding clash that cracked through the valley like a thunderclap. The king's voice boomed, "Hear me, Legion! This wanderer, bearer of the mark, stands under my protection, and from this dawn forward, he is to be protected, honored, and obeyed as one who upheld the deepest law, the law of mercy." A chorus of voices erupted. "Honor to the chosen, honor to the stew-bearer, honor to the king's friend." Arlen nearly stumbled. The magnitude was overwhelming. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't noble. He had no army, no throne, no lineage. But the king placed his enormous hand on Arlen's shoulder, steadying him with a warmth unexpected from someone who could crush boulders. "Come," the king said gently. "Walk beside me. The world will soon know your name, but before that, you must know mine." As they walked through the sea of armored warriors, the king told his story, of betrayal that fractured his throne, of enemies who feared his strength, of exile meant to break his spirit. He had wandered disguised as a vagabond, testing the hearts of men, waiting for one soul who would show compassion without recognition or reward. And Arlen, without knowing, had restored the king's faith and thus triggered the return of a kingdom, long fractured. By the time the sun climbed high and the warriors prepared their march, Arlen felt a strange fire ignite within his chest. Not fear, not confusion, but purpose, a purpose born not of power but of kindness. As the legion thundered forward, the king raised his voice one last time. "Arlen, remember this: when the world sees you, when they bow, when they cheer your name, remind them it all began with a simple act of humanity." And as they marched toward the future, Arlen knew his story, once quiet and ordinary, had transformed into something vast and immortal, destined to echo across ages. And to all who would one day hear it, his message would remain simple: greatness begins with kindness.